Well, we're gonna wrap up Elijah. I'd hope to get to the Moses part of the book, but it's in the book, so you can read that yourself. And we've been following Elijah, and we saw this morning that after his greatest triumph, I mean the greatest success in ministry he's ever had, he plunges to his greatest failure. By the way, have you noticed? You're typically more vulnerable after a success than you are after a failure, right? After a success, after a failure, what do? Failures tend to drive you to your knees, don't they? Failures humble you. Failures make you realize you don't have all the answers and you need God to help you. Failures get me to my knees pretty quickly as I cry out to God and say, God, please don't let me do that again. Once is enough. God, help me to whatever I need to learn, but don't let me do that again. But what does success do? Success makes you start giving advice to other people. Success makes you start thinking, I think I got this thing finally figured out. Success leaves you blindsided to the enemy who's going to have a rebuttal to what you've just done. And so Elijah, when he was, if you notice in chapter 17, he's in very humble situation. He's in wilderness. He's in a starving widow's home, and he never complains. He never gets it wrong. When does he actually stumble? Right after his greatest success. Be careful. You know, when someone fails, hopefully they start looking for people to counsel them, to give them advice. I need some people to come alongside me and help me out. But when we have success, we don't tend to surround, oh boy, I've got to get some people to help me. I've got to get people to praying for me. I just had the greatest success of my life. I better get a couple of accountability partners so I can stay the course. We don't do that, do we? In fact, you know what, I just have, at least just look at my own life, sometimes I think God has impressed upon me that He might give me more success if I could handle it. God gives me as much success as I can handle sometimes. I just don't have the humility, I don't have the guardrails in place around my life to handle more success than I have right now, for fear I might become like another Elijah. We notice that Elijah, he's ready to quit. He's been on the mountaintop, now he's ready to quit. Can I just say something? This may sound like mercy is not necessarily my giftedness, so I need to be more merciful. But can I just say this? I suspect if I went around the room and asked everybody here, is your God a powerful God? I suspect that everybody here would say, yes, He's powerful. He's the most powerful person in the universe. He created the universe. He created life. He holds the whole universe together. He holds time in His hand. I mean, there's nobody more powerful. You might pull out your doctrinal statement and say, look, this is my doctrinal beliefs right here. Go to our website. It has all of our beliefs, and here's a whole statement about the omnipotence of God. But you know, if I really wanted to know how powerful your God was, I wouldn't have to look at your statement of faith. All I would have to do is find out what you quit, or who you've given up on, or what you've given up on. And I would know how powerful your God was. Have you ever had a vision and said, God, I've had people say, I know God wants us to start this church. It's just as clear as can be. God has led us to do that. 2 years later, they've moved on. It didn't work out. Have you ever had anyone you were praying for maybe for years for their salvation? Every year, every new prayer journal, you put their name on the list and you prayed for them all year. But after 10 years of praying for their salvation, they don't seem any closer than before. And the next year, 2018 rolls around, you don't put their name back on the list. Let's just make room for someone that's more open. I prayed for 10 years, nothing's happened. God has convicted me that the moment I give up on somebody or something, I've just made an announcement. I don't believe that with God all things are possible. Because if I believed it, I wouldn't have given up on that person. I wouldn't have quit. The reason I quit is I've announced even God could not start a church in this city. Even God could not save somebody as lost as that person. And folks, you've just made a declaration of your faith when you give up on somebody. And so here's Elijah. He was on Mount Carmel saying, my God is alive. He is all powerful. But the next day, he's ready to quit the ministry and announce he's not so powerful. He can't do everything. And so he starts to run. By the way, do you notice, I said this morning, we're kind of noticing how God restores people. Because you will probably, every one of you at some point, have to encourage and restore someone who's discouraged. And God has a great track record of doing that. And He doesn't always do it the way you and I would do it. So you notice, like for instance with God, Elijah's up by Mount Carmel, and he comes down to Jezreel, about 17 or so miles down from the mountain. And then he bolts. And I think what happened, this is what I think happened. He's on Mount Carmel, he has this enormous victorious day, and then it doesn't say God told him to do it, but it does say God helped him do it. He goes down the mountain, outruns the storm, and comes to Jezreel. And Jezreel is where Ahab's palace is. That's his capital city. So what do you think is going through Elijah's mind when he has the best day of ministry in his life, and then God says, go to the very city where the king and queen live? He might have been just hanging out near the king's palace. What do you think he's assuming? I should be getting an invitation any time now. The king ought to be sending over a messenger saying, the king and queen would like to have tea with you today. After what happened yesterday on Mount Carmel, they've reconsidered some of their approaches. They'd like to talk to you. I can just see Elijah hanging out around Jezreel waiting for that invitation. And you know what and then instead of the invitation, the messenger does come, but it's not inviting him for tea. It's saying, when we get our hands on you, you're a dead man. You see, what I've discovered as well in ministry, something that God has really been teaching me lately is, you know, we often deal with disappointment, don't we? Just sadly, in ministry, I doubt any of us have not been disappointed at some point in ministry. But you know one of the reasons we get disappointed? It's because we have what we expected doesn't turn out. And you see, for me, one of the problems is I expect the wrong things. I expect what I think should happen. I expect what I think is fair. What I think God should do. And then when God doesn't behave the way that I think He should, or people don't behave the way I think they should, I get disappointed. You know, most of the people I find that leave ministry they don't leave because of immorality. They don't even necessarily, even burnout. I'll tell you, see, burnout is epidemic in ministry, but burnout doesn't happen because people work too hard. I know people working hard as anybody around, and they love what they do. They're invigorated by it. What burns you out is when you work really hard and you don't get the results that you had hoped for. And then all of a sudden you're exhausted, and then the payday you thought was coming doesn't come. That is demoralizing. To work that hard and then not get the results you had been working for and hoping for. And one of the things God had to teach me was, let God give me my expectations. You know, every time you say to God, it's not fair, that just reveals you were aiming for your expectations, not God's. God had to remind me, servants don't set expectations. Servants obey. Servants just show up where God told them to show up, and they do what God told them. If you're getting disappointed, it's because as a servant you had your own expectations of what your service ought to produce. And I've had to just say, God, please free me of all those expectations that could lead to disappointment. Just let me be found faithful. A servant doesn't say, Master, I'm quitting. If I didn't get the result, you didn't treat me the way I thought I should be treated. This isn't fair, Master, so I'm out of here. Servants don't do that. They just obey. But Elijah was expecting, I think, something different. After the best day of ministry of his life, he didn't get it. So he bolts, he runs. And he goes over 100 miles to Beersheba. And by the way, do you know something else about God? I mean, it takes... Commentators kind of figure that on average you're going to walk about 5 miles a day in that climate with those sandals. And so that might have taken 5 days or so if he's walking hard, maybe a little shorter if he's really angry and upset and he's walking fast. But he's been walking for over 100 miles to get to Beersheba. At what point in the narrative we saw this morning does God actually talk to him, or the angel? When does the angel actually start talking to him?
After he gets there.
Yeah, when he stops. When he stops running, right? Now, when could God have started talking to him? The moment he started heading south out of Jezreel and started to go south, God could have said, hey, wait, where do you think you're going? Wait, I didn't tell you to go anywhere. But he lets him go, right? Day 1, he goes hard all day, no word from an angel. Day 2, keeps going. He's 100 miles down the road, dismisses his servant, goes another day's journey into the wilderness, finally stops and goes to sleep, and then God deals with him. Why do you think God let him get to the end of himself before he started dealing with him? Have you ever tried to counsel someone who was still in a full-out retreat, who was running away from God? You're not going to have much success with that. God lets him run, lets him wear himself out. I've seen people, I've seen the signs, I've tried to intervene. I've tried to intervene as they were running away from God, and I've not had all that much success. They're determined to go. But when they finally stop, there's God. And sometimes I've helped people deal with prodigals. And prodigals sometimes, they don't listen to reason until they get to that far country, do they? And now they're in the pig pen. Then for the first time, they start to hear. You can try, you can plead with them, but don't be surprised if they keep running until they get to the end of themselves. Then the angel touches him and starts talking to him. And so I want us just to look, by the way, one other thing about God and him dealing with us. My dad often said this, I think is very true. He said, you can leave God on your terms, but you can only come back to God on his terms. Have you ever known people that fell into immorality and then they were trying to negotiate their way and set their terms on how they were coming back? You can't do that. You can leave on your terms, but you only come back on his. And his path of return always involves humility and the direction, the path he chooses for you to take. And so you notice in verse 19, the angel fed him, watered him, rested him. And then it says that he went to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave, and there he spent the night. Now, one thing that's interesting for me about this is, here's a man who's ready to quit. He's suicidal. He says he wants to die. And then, here's a guy who wants to die and quit and doesn't want to be in ministry anymore. And then God basically takes him 200 miles. From Beersheba to Sinai is 200 miles. So at 5 miles a day, it's going to take him 40 days to get down to Mount Sinai. Now, if you're suicidal and you're ready to quit, I mean, God's finally found him here in Beersheba. Why doesn't God just deal with him right there? Why doesn't God say, I finally found you, just stay right there, we're going to work this thing out? But he actually has Elijah go for 40 days to Mount Sinai. Now, we don't really know whose idea it was. God doesn't really tell him to go to Mount Sinai, he just equips him to go. And again, you remember what I said about Elijah? Most of his life is spent preparing for his next encounter with God. Now he's going to spend 40 days fasting, basically. He's going to have the most impactful encounter he ever has with God. And it comes on the heels of 40 days of fasting. By the way, do you ever think you might have a more profound encounter with God if you took more time to prepare for it? Have you ever known people, have you ever thought on Sunday mornings if people might have a greater encounter with God if they had been better prepared when they walked in the door? They hadn't been arguing with their spouse on the way to church. They hadn't been snapping at their kids, frustrated at the traffic and the lack of parking. They hadn't stayed up too late the night before watching late night TV so that they were groggy on the way to church. I can tell you as a church attender, the greatest encounters I've ever had in church have been when I got up early that morning and took time to get my heart right with God before I ever made my way to church. God loves to prepare his people for an encounter, and we're not good at that. With our busy schedules, we breeze in, race in, our minds going 1,000 directions, our phones in our hand, checking on all kinds of messaging, and then suddenly the worship music starts and we've got to somehow get ourselves in the right frame of mind. God prepares him, but if this is Elijah's idea, let me ask you this. If Elijah's so discouraged he's ready to kill himself and quit, and then he decides, well, no, I'm going to go 200 miles to Mount Sinai. Why would he choose to go to Mount Sinai? Why go so far out of the way? You don't have to travel 200 miles for God to restore you, do you? Why would he go there? Well, what had happened there before? That was, you're talking about an awesome encounter with God. It was a terrifying place. The Israelites, when they were there with Moses, were terrified. They said, Moses, you go up there. We don't dare get anywhere near that mountain. We'll die. There's smoke, there's fire, there's sounds of trumpets, there's lightning. It was a terrifying place. And have you ever, I just sort of think that Elijah might have been thinking, you know, quiet times are great. I mean, any quiet time you can meet with God. But sometimes you kind of need a Mount Sinai experience, don't you? You just sort of need, not the ordinary. You need a profound encounter with God. And of course, Elijah had heard about Moses' encounter. By the way, the only two people ever met with God on Mount Sinai that we know of. It's going to be Elijah, and of course it was Moses. And so, isn't it interesting on the Mount of Transfiguration, when God, if you knew that your child was going to be executed in a few days, and you could bring anyone in to visit him before he was put to death, who would you want to go visit your son? Well, the father brought a couple of his disciples with him, but then he also brought two people from the dead. Now, if God could bring anybody from the dead to encourage his son, can you imagine if he brought Adam? And Jesus could say, Adam, this is all your fault. If you just had shown a little more self-control, I wouldn't have to be dying on this cross in a few days. He might have brought Job. Job could say, listen, I know about suffering. You know, I know about, or it could have been David. Could have brought all kinds of people. But he brought Moses and Elijah. Of course, Moses represented the law, and Elijah represented the prophets. But they also were the only two men who'd ever met with God on Mount Sinai before. They knew what it was like to have a mountaintop experience. In fact, if you notice Elijah and Moses, but Elijah, his whole career is sort of defined by mountaintop moments. There's Mount Carmel. There's going to be Mount Sinai. He's going to end up on the Mount of Transfiguration in the New Testament. There's just these sort of, wouldn't it be great if ministry was a series of mountaintop experiences? But you know what I've discovered? God does some amazing work in the wilderness. He does some awesome work on the mountaintops. But whether it's a wilderness or a mountaintop, those are never meant to be end destinations. Those are meant to be pit stops, preparation times for you to go back down where the people are, where the work is. And so Elijah decides to go to Mount Sinai, even though it's going to take him 40 more days. It's like he's making a pilgrimage to this awesome mountain where the greatest giant of the Old Testament to that point, Moses, when he was discouraged, what did he do? Moses said, God, I've got to have an encounter with you. So Elijah travels 40 days, gets to Mount Sinai, and this text says that Elijah goes up and goes in a cave. And he spends the night in the cave. Now, what would be another word for a cave and a mountain? What's another word for a cave? Well, you might call it a cleft. A cleft. Do you remember when Moses was ready to quit in his own experience? And he was getting discouraged working with people that were not behaving as he thought they should? And finally, what did Moses say? I can't take, God, if I'm going to keep doing this, I need a fresh encounter with you. Show me your glory. And so he goes, and God, of course, says, well, you can't look upon my face, he'll kill you. But he said, I'll let my glory pass by you. And as God's glory passed by, where does God puts his hand over him, and where does he put Moses? In a cleft, in a hollow, some kind of cave in the side of the mountain. And his glory passed by. And it was the supreme moment in Moses' walk with God. I just sort of think that Elijah must have been looking for that cleft. I mean, it doesn't say that that's the one he was in. But Moses knew that story. And he's thinking, if Moses needed an encounter with the glory of God, that's what I need right now. I need to see it full on, just the glory of God. Where would that cleft have been? Where would that encounter that Moses had with God centuries before. And so he goes and he finds the cave, and he says, God, that's what I need now too. And he's asleep. Well, so that's where God finds him. Just take a moment and just look at just what God does when God gets there. It says, suddenly, and I mentioned that this morning, the suddenness of God. He's been sleeping all night. It's in this dark cave. You never know. You cannot just summon God, right? You can't snap your fingers and say, God, I need you here right now. All you can do is set the table for God, right? You can just get yourself prepared in a place that God is pleased in His timing to come to you. It says, suddenly the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? I love that. I love that quote. Now, again, Elijah's AWOL. At this point, he's over 300 miles away from where God last told him to be. And so when all of a sudden, you're 300 miles off course, you've quit, you've shut down your office, you've dismissed your staff, and then out of the blue, so what all might Elijah have thought God would say? You miserable turncoat, you AWOL, you've got a court-martial coming. God could have said many things. You know, one of the things I've discovered lately, our ministry has a coaching ministry, leadership coaching that we provide. We teach people how to be coaches, and we offer coaching. But I'll just tell you this. For years and years, I've been around pastors and leaders, and I might be in a place like this, and I only had so much time, and so people would come to talk to me, and I might only have one time to sit down with them at a table, and so we've got 40 minutes until the next session. And so I'm thinking to myself, what can I say to this person that will help them? What have I said to other people that people have found helpful? What are some scriptures I could put on the table? What's some counsel that has just generally some good advice that I could give in this situation? And I'm trying to say as much as I can. But you know what I've been convicted of late? With God, could God not have made a declaration? Could God not have said, this is the problem? Behold, you are 300 miles off course. You disobeyed. God could have just laid it out, right? But what does God do? He asks a question. And I'm fascinated by the questions of God. You see, I could come and say, listen, here's the answer. Here's what you need to know. But I'll tell you something, it's far more powerful if you ask the right questions, so suddenly the person you're dealing with comes face to face with God themselves. They don't need to hear you give them the answer. They need to discover the answer as you lead them into the presence of God. Too many times I've short-circuited people and just cut through the whole process. Hey, we don't have much time, so here's the answer. This is what you need to know. It takes longer. It takes longer to ask questions. But I can promise you, if you learn, I always kept thinking, what's the most profound statement I can make? So as they leave, they think, wow, when Richard said that, that was awesome. Instead of asking the right question that leaves them just spellbound when they realize the lights come on. All of a sudden they're face to face with God, and you haven't told them the right answer, you've led them to the right answer. Right. You've just sort of guided them and helped pass, by asking the right questions, they find themselves face to face with the answer. And by the way, aren't God's questions interesting? Like, think of some of God's questions, like, Adam and Eve, where are you? Cain, where's your brother? One of my, of course, Jesus, who do you say? So I did a series one time at the Billy Graham Cove on the questions of God. And I said, we always think our questions are a big deal, right? Like, I hear people all the time say, when I get to heaven, I'm going to ask God this, I'm going to ask God that. Like, in the South, it's like, well, God, if fried food is so bad for your cholesterol, why did you make it taste so good? It's like, when I get to heaven, I've got all these questions I'm going to ask. And we think it's a big deal. We have people saying, I can't become a Christian. I can't believe. I'm not going to obey until God answers these questions. But the really profound questions are not the ones we have for God, but the ones He has for us. You remember Job? All the way through Job keeps saying, if I could just get God on the witness stand, I could interrogate Him, and I could grill Him, I could prove that I'm innocent. Oh, just get God on that stand and let me cross-examine Him, and I'll prove that I'm a righteous person. And if He's just determined, let me ask God my questions. why he lets righteous people like me suffer, and after all I've done for him, like, how could he let this happen? And then chapter 38 comes around. And it says, God answered him in a whirlwind, which should have alerted him there was going to be trouble. And then what does God ask? He said, where were you? Where were you? When I was putting the whole universe, when I was putting all the stars in place, where were you when I was doing that? When I was creating life, where were you? I don't recall seeing you there when life was being formed. And where were you when I put the mountains in place? And I put the great sea creatures in place? And by the time God has finished asking his questions, guess what? Job doesn't have any more questions. But see, if you can have an answer for God's question, you have an answer for all of yours as well. And so God has this way of asking a penetrating question that just lays you bare. And so he just simply says, what are you doing here? And that could mean a number of things, like, why are you 300 miles off course? Or it could mean, Elijah, the last time I saw you, you were triumphantly having victory and calling fire down from heaven. Why are you curled up in a fetal position in a dark cave 300 miles away, quitting and giving up and having a pity party? A pity party, Elijah. That's not where I found you the last time we talked. How did you get here? Could God ask that of us? I remember the day that you walked down that aisle and said, God is calling me to missions. And you were ready to take on anything, take on all the demons of hell single-handedly. And now you're waffling and you're wondering if you should quit and you're giving up. And I remember when you were so passionate, your pastor used to have to say, oh, whoa, just slow down a little bit here. Leave a few lost people for the others to save. And now it's like I got to have someone prop me up. I don't have the energy to get out of bed sometimes. Could God say to you, how did you get there? How did you get there? That's not where you used to be. Those devastating questions of God. Well, notice just quickly here, we'll just kind of wrap this up, but Elijah replies and says, I've been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, which is kind of funny, really. I mean, he has been zealous, but at the moment he's 300 miles away from where he was last told to be. Isn't it interesting? We can insist that we are completely devout to God. And you remember King Saul when Samuel came and had that, same thing. It's like, Saul quickly starts speaking first and says, I've been completely obedient. I've done everything God said. And then that devastating question, what's that sound of the bleating of sheep in my ear? Those devastating questions that just lay you bare. And now Elijah is saying, I've been zealous. But he says, but the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life. Now, there's a couple things interesting about that. I mentioned the other day that, for one thing, he says, I'm all alone. And I would have said, well, you wouldn't be all alone if you hadn't let your servant go. He walked 100 miles with you. Why didn't, you're only alone because you chose to isolate yourself. What else do you notice about this? Did you notice his pronouns? It's like them, it's what they're doing. By the way, can I just say this? If God called you to ministry, no person can cancel that call. God's the one who called Elijah into ministry, and now he's pointing to everybody else, saying, well, I quit because what they did, and what they did, and what they did. Folks, what other people do have nothing to do with your call of God. I've had so many people say, well, I just couldn't put up with the nonsense. People were criticizing me. People were opposing me. Well, what does that have to do with the call of God? Did God tell you? I've called you and just keep on serving me as long as nobody criticizes you. Then you're out. You're free to go. Is that how God called you? There was no escape clause with the call of God. God didn't say if the funds ever get a little thin, just feel free to go find something else. Forget the call. God said, I've called you. And now Elijah is pointing to everybody else as an excuse why he doesn't have to stay with the call. And also, you notice it's interesting. I was with a pastor one time. I met with him after a meeting like this one night, and I said, "Hey, how's it going?" And he went, for an hour and a half, he told me of all the problems. He had deacons criticizing him. He had a staff person that was rebellious. He had some immorality. He had this, he had that. The economy was bad. And for an hour and a half, he just kind of laid out all the problems in his ministry. And finally, after an hour and a half, I said, I don't want to treat what you're going through lightly. I realize this is really painful. But I said, can I just observe something that I've noticed? I said, I asked you what's going on in your ministry, and you've taken an hour and a half to detail what's going on in your ministry. But in an hour and a half, you have not mentioned God one time. I said, you know what that tells me? You're looking in all the wrong places. Now that doesn't mean that all those negative things aren't happening. But you put all the negative things of your ministry on the table, and if you're going to be thorough, you've also got to put the presence of God on the table too, don't you? And how does that change everything? Now it doesn't mean those other things aren't there. But when you put God on the table, it changes the whole perspective, doesn't it? And Elijah has just given God a complete litany of how he sees the situation. He hasn't mentioned God once. That's always a warning sign to me. This guy's looking in the wrong places. You keep your eyes fixated on your critics, you'll be out of the ministry before long. You get your eye focused on the problems, you'll be out of the ministry. Deal with your problems, but just look at your problems with God right next to the problems. Realize that's also even more of a reality than what your critics are doing. And so Elijah is talking about all the wrong things. And then just notice verse 11, it says, then he said, go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence. So, you know what's interesting, by the way, and people have debated this before and said, does God welcome your complaints? If you're upset, do you just go to God and tell him, God, I'm upset, and I'm upset about all these things, like the psalmist did, right? I think God welcomes your questions. If you've got questions, you've got complaints, take them to God. It's the best place to take them. And so Elijah does, right? How does God deal with his complaints? Now he welcomes you, if that's what you want to do. Does he answer, Elijah? He's not. He welcomes your complaints. He does not feel obligated to answer them point by point. You see, prayer is a conversation between two people, two very unequal people. And so it's a conversation. You talk, but so does he. And what happens a lot of times is, and what Elijah's trying to do is, he's trying to hijack the prayer time. Like, have you ever wanted to pray but on your terms? Like, where you came to God with the agenda of the prayer meeting? God, here's what I want to talk to you about. These people that are not appreciating me, these people who said they'd support me and they're not, this person who's been insubordinate, this person I did all these nice things for, they didn't thank me once. And so Elijah says, God, here's all the issues. I've laid them all out for you. And what does God do? Doesn't address one of them. Instead, what does he say? He says, get out of the cave. Now again, if God found Elijah, his servant, in a cave, why doesn't he just deal with him right there? Why does he say, since I found you here in the cave, let's talk it out right here? Why does he say, get up, move out? Well, what do you see when you're in a cave? Darkness, shadows, right? Stark walls. Now you could be in a cave at the top of Mount Everest. What are you going to see? Darkness. Have you ever tried to encourage someone in a dark, dismal cave? When you can say, it's not so bad. But everywhere they look, they see darkness, right? And so what does God do? He says, before we even start talking, get up and take a few steps this way. Can you imagine? All you see is darkness. You take 5 steps to the west, and suddenly you're on the outside of Mount Sinai. Now you're at the top of Mount Sinai, looking out over the whole Judean desert, or the whole Sinai desert. And now you see blue sky. All you saw were dark shadows before. Now you see blue sky. You see eagles flying by. You feel the warm sun. You see wildflowers. 5 steps in a different direction, the whole perspective changes, doesn't it? Have you ever noticed the difference? Sometimes the first thing before you try to help someone is get them to a healthier place. Sometimes, let's go meet at an outdoor cafe. There's sunshine today. Let's go where we can see the mountains, and then let's talk about God. I tell you, God is masterful at helping people change their perspective. I've sometimes made the mistake of staying in the cave trying to encourage people it's not as gloomy as it appears. But sometimes what you need to do is let's go for a bike ride today. Let's get out in the country. Let's go look at something majestic. And then let's talk about God. The first thing he says is get out of the cave. And he doesn't carry him out. He says you get up and go. You get up. You still have it in you to walk out of that cave. So Elijah walks out of the cave. And then, of course, that wonderful account. We'll just read it quickly and I'll wrap it up. You're familiar with this part. But it says, at the moment the Lord passed by, great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire there was a voice, a soft whisper. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly a voice came. Isn't that interesting? I mean, I'm sure you've all studied that. An earthquake comes, a mighty wind comes, fire comes, and of course, any one of those, if you're a really discouraged person, that seems like a pretty good way to get a person pumped up, is it not? To get them thinking again about the power of God, but God's not in any of those. And you know what's interesting about that? I've thought a lot about why God wasn't in one of those, and of course, only a few weeks before, Elijah had experienced much of that already, hadn't he? He'd had fire, certainly. There was a lot of shouting and people, a lot of commotion and a big congregation shouting, God, He's God. A lot of that going on. And you know, in our day and age, and I really appreciate the worship we've had this week. Hasn't it been just wonderful? But I get around a lot of worship leaders. And they're not all created equal. And the overall trend today is we need to be really loud. We need to really have a lot of lights flashing and a lot of pounding because we serve a mighty God. And so if God is awesome, the music ought to be epic and over the top. And more and more and more, it seems like I like praise music. I like upbeat music. I grew up rock and roll. I like rock and roll music. I have no problem with it. But it's like all we can do, if you're going to represent God, you have to be loud. And what I find I would say the majority of worship teams today, we don't know how to do quiet. We don't know how to do reflective. All we know how to do is, let's praise God. And every song is just loud, deafening at times in some of the auditoriums I've been in. And it's like, if you're going to represent God, it's got to be loud. But this is the thing that I think is interesting. Elijah had loud, like he'd had fire coming down from heaven. He'd had an entire mountaintop of people shouting and saying, let's kill all the Baal priests and so on. And it doesn't get more epic than that, does it? And after one of the most epic encounters ever with God, how long did it take after that loud worship time before Elijah's ready to quit? One day. But there's something about the whisper of God. There's something about everything going quiet and all you hear is the whisper of God. Of course, when God whispers, you have to listen, don't you? And a whisper has a way of going right to the very depths of your soul. Elijah had fire from heaven, and a day later he's ready to quit. On this occasion, he has God whisper to his soul. You never hear of Elijah wanting to quit again. We need to provide some moments where people can hear the divine whisper. It spoke to his soul in such a way that he was a different man after that. Well, if you just fast forward, the last thing I just point out to you, there's a lot there, but he says what's going to happen. You're going to anoint 2 kings, you're going to anoint your successor Elisha, and of course when he says you're going to anoint a successor to Ahab, you know, one of the questions I'm sure Elijah wanted to ask God is, why do you let a government leader that wicked hang around so long? He's causing so much grief. But you know, if you read the story of Ahab, several times God says you're going to get it. And Ahab actually goes soft and repents, and God relents, bringing judgment for a time. You know, and I thought to myself, God was very gracious to Ahab. I mean, he should have taken Ahab out a long time sooner. I would have, if I were God. But do you notice how patient he is with Ahab? He actually relents. At one point he says, get ready, you're going to die. Ahab repents and God relents. But do you notice something that's interesting to me? When God is being patient with an evil person, it means sometimes that the righteous people suffer as a consequence. Have you ever noticed that? Have you ever thought of any other world leaders that you wonder why God doesn't take out? Well, as God is patient with that person, it means other people suffer. It's just the way it works. We're on the same planet. If God's going to be patient with an evildoer, it means that righteous people are going to be victimized in the meantime. And Elijah's like, look, I've been a fugitive for years because you're patient with Ahab. When are you going to give them what they deserve? So that finally us righteous people can kind of get a break. And now he hears it's coming. It's justice always comes with God. Not always as quickly as we'd like, but it's coming. And then the very last thing he says is, there's an Elisha I'd like you to meet. Which, you know what that tells you? If you're an Elijah, could you ever think that someone could take your place? What does that tell you? None of us are irreplaceable, are we? Not even an Elijah, not even a Moses. We're all replaceable. Might not be the same replacement, but don't ever think you're indispensable. That's a dangerous place to be. Even Elijah is replaceable. But this is the thing I think is interesting. God says, now go find Elisha. When he finds him, what's Elisha doing? He's a farm boy, right? And he's got 12 yoke of oxen. I mean, he's a big, strong farm boy. And when Elijah comes and throws his mantle on him, Elisha is, I love Elisha because it's like, you got to be kidding! You're calling me? And he slaughters an ox and he burns up one of the yoke and he throws a party for himself. It's like, hey everybody, just want to say goodbye because I'm going with Elijah. You may never see me again because I don't know where he's taking me. So just in case I never see you again, it's really been nice knowing you. I hope you enjoy the ox meat here, and because I'm going with him. And I can just imagine Elisha saying to Elijah, where are we going next? What are we going to do? We're going to take on Ahab? What are we going to do? And I can just imagine Elijah. No wonder he just kind of says, keeps trying to leave him behind somewhere. It's like, whenever people look at Elijah and Elisha, they always say, well, that's a model of mentoring. That's a model of, the older guy pouring into the young guy, and which that did happen. But you know what I think? When Elijah is listening to this real enthusiastic guy, just on the, hey, let's go. No argument, no questions. I'm with you, Elijah. Whatever God wants us to do, that's what I'm going to do. What do you think might have crossed through Elijah's mind? Elijah might have looked at that young buck and thought, that was me one time. I used to be like that. When I got my call, I was just as enthusiastic as him. I'm not sure what happened to me. Here I was, just not that long ago, telling God I quit. I was done, and now I'm partnered with this enthusiastic young guy who can't believe that he gets the privilege of serving God. Here I was just trying to find someone to hand my resignation into. I think that Elijah got just as much out of that relationship as Elisha did. I think God knew the best cure for a tired, worn-out, old minister of the gospel is to get partnered with a young guy just coming up, still thrilled that God would use him. Can I just tell you something? If you're getting a little weary or tired, there is no better remedy than investing in the next generation. And there's just no reason to go visit someone in the hospital, or go make an evangelistic visit, or go drive to another town to preach at a conference and not bring some young guy with you that you can talk with all the way there in the car. Take him into the hospital and say, listen, we're going to go meet a man who won't be alive next week. So just pray with me as we go in, and let's just see if God won't do a work in his life. And let's go for coffee. Let's talk about what happened tonight. And I'll tell you what, it will change your ministry. I got convicted about that. As I was racing here and there, I was doing it alone so much of the time. But I could have brought some young guy to see the thrill it looks like to do ministry for the King. And maybe I didn't want him to see what it was looking like in my life, but Elijah, that was God's cure for him. Just get around a young guy, a young girl. Just pour your life into them. You can't stay cynical. You can't want to quit when you got this circle of young people all looking to you saying, well, tell us what it's been like. And you realize, you know what, I got to keep it together myself. And Elijah gets to the end of his ministry, and the last part of his ministry was ready to hand it off to someone else. You know, when I was at the seminary, I told you this morning, for 13 years, I honestly thought I was indispensable for a time at least. There really was nobody else qualified like I was. There was no other person in our denomination who was a Canadian citizen who had a PhD except me. And so, or who had the contacts and the skill set I had. So for years, I mean, it really was true. There was a period of time where there was nobody as qualified as me. And then one day I saw an Elisha walk by and I realized there's a younger guy who could do a better job. And I knew that it was time for me to look for my next assignment. I poured into that Elisha. I still go back and teach leadership classes with that Elisha at that same seminary. I still encourage him and support him and in contact pretty well every week. But I knew then it was time to move on. If there's no Elisha on the premises, it may not be time for you to move on yet. Make sure you leave someone behind when it's time for you to go to the next assignment. That's one of the ways I know it's time, because there's an Elisha ready to step in when I go. Well, it's been good to be with. Let me take a moment just to pray with you. And I pray, you know, I know that when these conferences are put together, the hope is that this will be a Mount Sinai experience for you. Hopefully not a wilderness experience, more of a Sinai experience. And mountaintops, if Elijah and Moses needed mountaintops experiences, and I assume that you probably do too, I hope that you've had something of that here. And I pray that whatever it is you needed just to be reminded of the Lord and how He works, that you've had some of that reminding as well. So let me take a moment just to pray with you, and I'll be done. Lord, thank you for these who have come, some from great distances, to be here in these days. Lord, if Elijah could grow weary in service to you, then I know we could as well. If Elijah, who saw you bring fire from heaven, who saw you raise the dead, could still get his eyes off of you and on to his critics, then we could be guilty of that as well. And so, Lord, I pray that if we've been looking in the wrong places, if we've been listening to the wrong voices, Lord, you'd help us once again. Some of us may be in that dark cave right now, God, and nobody is coming to pull us out. And it might be that you're asking us as well to get up and walk out of that dark place and see that there's a whole lot of light just a few steps away. God, don't let us stay in the darkness if you have a lot more that you want us to see of you. And so, God, I pray that this might be a turning point, a landmark time, an anchor point in our life that we'll look back to and realize we settled some things with you here that freed us to go to a deeper and a better place with you in our service and in our walk with you. May certainly, Lord, our best days of service for you lie ahead of us and not behind us. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.